I'm good, Christopher. I'm good. Right, guys, we're going to be discussing the public sector in this regard, and we're basically going to be looking at a couple of things. Today's lesson will go as far, and if you're following me in your textbooks, it will go as far as 5.7. We'll go as far as 5.7, being nationalization and privatization, and then we'll leave the rest for our next lecture. So the first thing that we realize, especially just around the public sector, is that we're obviously talking about the government. The government is the public sector in that regard. And the government consists of four different types of sectors. And those sectors are the central government, which is concerned only with national issues. And this is when you start thinking about things like foreign affairs, um, huge things, basically, that the government would be, in charge of. And then we've also got your regional or provincial government as well. And this is concerned mainly with regional issues. You'll hear about education and health, about particular provinces. Not every province, but particular provinces, right? And this is interesting because you realize that when it comes to educational demands, health demands, depending on which province you're from, there are different demands. And therefore, there needs to be a regional or provincial, government. And I know that there's two different elections in that regard, being countrywide, nationwide, and obviously your provincial as well. And then we have local government, which is concerned with local issues, and that would be things like your municipality when it comes to sewage, local roads, street lighting, and all of that. That is basically a local government situation. And then the last is your public corporations, which is more of your ESCOM, your Transnet, your Rand Water. All of these are basically your government business enterprises. Whoops, so that too fast. What I want you guys to highlight in your books will be the following. Firstly, on page 310, I want you to have a look at figure 15.1. And that already illustrates to us the importance it already tells us the importance and the ranking of the importance as well. The composition of the public sector, with the central government being in the middle, the general government being the provincial and local government, and thereafter the public sector as well. What I want you to highlight would be the bullet points, being the central government, regional government, the local government, and the public corporations as well. And more importantly, I want you to highlight the examples of those particular governments as well. Then I'd want us to highlight the following on page 310. So, right at the bottom left-hand corner, last sentence, it says the government provides them with goods and services such as law and order, health services, education, and housing. Apart from these goods and services, government also makes transfer payments to households and firms. To finance these goods and services, households and firms pay taxes to government. In addition, the government also influences the economic activity of households and firms through regulation. This aspect or role of the government is not captured in the circular flow diagram such as 15.2. And when we look at figure 15.2, we realize that we have seen this before somewhere. We're just basically building on top of it. Government uses its tax revenue to purchase the inputs required to provide public goods and services. These inputs include labor, which is purchased from households, and goods such as computer equipment, stationery, uniforms, and building materials, which are purchased from firms. The payments by government the payments by government constitute income for households and firms. There are thus continuous flows of goods and services and income between the public, being the government, and the private sector, being households and firms. Guys, I just want to find out any questions in concern with 15.1, the government or public sector? Just let me know in the chat. But if you've understood everything, then just give me a thumbs up. Yes, Kieran. Go ahead, Kieran.
So I just wanted to ask, so basically what this diagram is showing is that the general government is, so it forms part of the public sector. So it's kind of like the micro, market, and macro, where let's just say, for instance, the government would be the market and the public sector would be the macro. So it's like okay, no, actually, no, that's actually kind of bad. But so basically, the public sector is bigger than just the government.
Interesting. So in essence, yes, there's more roles that obviously take place in the public sector, 100%, than they would in the central government. So you'll find, like, let's say there'll be the president, the cabinets, and so forth. General government will be the so yes, more people. The less you go down the list, or the more you go into the square, the more people obviously are of service. But it's all a macro issue, though. Is that good, Kieran?
Oh, sorry. My connection kind of fuzzed there. Can you just repeat it, please, sir?
Sure, not a problem. I was just saying that your central government,
Yes.
all the way until the rest of the square, you find that the numbers obviously increase as to the number of people that are serving in those capacities. But all in all,
Uh,
that whole box is basically a macro issue, no micro in essence.
um. Okay, so thank you.
Also, no problem. Ria, so you said something about importance. Is the central government the most important? Yes, it is the most important, um, because it handles national issues. That's why I would regard it as more important than the rest. That doesn't mean that the rest aren't important. It's just most important. Very welcome, man. Very welcome. Right, guys. If that's the only question that I have, then I would ask you the following. Name the four sectors that constitute the South African government and give an example of each. Please do that in the chat. Let's get this party started. Name the four sectors that constitute the South African government and give an example of each. Put that into the chat. Okay, guys, the four sectors that constitute the government are the central government, the regional government, the local government, and the public government. Oh, there we go. There we go. Absolutely, guys. Absolutely. Thank you very much, Mr. Christopher. And thank you for your honesty as well, Kieran. I highly always, as always, appreciate it. Right, let's shift focus. Let's shift focus. It says list the broad functions of government. Let's go through that. So basically, when it comes down to the government as a whole, it has three different things that it does from a function perspective. Right, and for now, we're just going to ask for your ear, and then obviously we'll get it down to the highlights of where all this information is. And when we talk about allocative function, we refer to the role of the government in correcting market failure and achieving a more efficient allocation of resources. Because sometimes resources are not allocated appropriately, and therefore the government needs to step in and ensure that that happens. We also have your distributive function, and that refers to the steps taken by government to achieve a more equitable or social acceptable distribution of income than that generated by market forces. And in this case, we're talking about how obviously the rich get richer and the poor get poorer as a result of market forces at work. And what they try to do is figure out how can we change that in order to ensure that everybody basically gets somewhat equitable stake of the pie. Now, does that translate into it being realistic? I wouldn't think so. But it is a good effort nonetheless, because we do have people who are more needy of certain things of the economy, and we should, by all means, try to make sure that we assist them. Then the last one that we have, guys, is now stabilization. And this obviously refers to measures taken by the government to promote macroeconomic stability. I mean, we discussed a bit of that through the monetary policy. Here we might talk about the fiscal, I think it's called the fiscal policy and your deficit as well. Some tools that government uses in order to make sure that this country as a whole is obviously one that runs smoothly. So those are three broad functions, and we'll obviously get into detail as to what and how we get through that. Now, government intervenes into the marketplace uh, through five ways. First and foremost, they do so through public provision of goods and services. This is them giving goods and services. This could be your local hospital, it could be your police enforcement, it could be the army, but they actually provide goods and services. I'm going to also get into what types of goods and services these guys produce very well. We also look at market participation as well, and this is them going through entities or growing through entities like your Gautrain, as Christopher put across. That is them in the marketplace. Rand Water, Eskom, and Transnet. That's them once again in the marketplace. Then we have government spending, and government spending is basically the fact that these guys, the government as a whole, are the biggest spenders nationally and the biggest employers as well. So when they spend and when they employ, it does the country some real good. And the question that we have to ask ourselves there is how does that happen? And we're going to study as to how that happens. Last one is taxation, and taxation in this case, guys, deals with redistribution of income and the grants that they give out, the social welfare checks that they give out. This plays part and parcel with the whole taxation, and obviously, it also enables government spending as well. Then the last thing that they do is regulation, making laws and policies and so forth that need to be adhered to by households and firms as well. Now, the reasons that government would intervene would be when monopolies and imperfect competition come into the fold, where you have one business owner who will basically own a huge majority of the marketplace, and therefore they can charge whatever they want to, and that doesn't help the rest of the economy. We need more equity in that regard, or more competition in that regard. So therefore, your government will look into how exactly can we ensure that there are no monopolies, or if there are monopolies, it's not big. There's some competition that happens. As I put across before, public goods really just deals with the goods that they manufacture and the goods that they obviously produce. Externalities, we've got positive and negative, and this really deals with third party benefits or third party costs, i.e., somebody who, let's say, smokes, negative externality of that would be secondhand smoking. So if you're around that individual, then you are smoking as well. Then we've got asymmetric information, and that deals with how we make decisions, but we never really know the marginal benefit and the marginal cost to its full extent. So we just make like specific decisions in order to get along with something, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we are in a space that we actually understand what decisions we're making completely. There's always a sense of a little bit of ignorance, and I say that with all due respect. Then the last, we talk about common property resources, which really deals with some public goods, and we go and talk about basically what exactly is that, and why does it matter that government actually intervenes when it comes to common property resources. In the chat, let me know, guys. When it comes down to government and how it participates around it fulfilling the promises that it says it's going to, let me know in the chat. Out of 10, what score would you give them on how they fulfill their promises? On a scale of 1 to 10, what would we rate our government when it comes to, oof, but Kieran that says 3, Caesar says 3, Luke says, oh, well, I'm going to do a bit better than Kieran and Caesar, and I'm going to give them a 4.25. And then there's Jared that says, you guys are being generous. I'm giving them a 2 out of 10. Everyone else, what's your take? What would you score the government? Okay, going up to a 5 nowadays with 0, so they're probably still on a 4 somewhere there. And yours, let me know. Let me know what you'd rate. Litle, Luke, or Wetty, Monica, Amber, Zima, Precious. Let me know. What would you guys rate the government? Scale of 1 to 10. Yo, deep. Okay. All right. I should capture this and send it to government officials. Let them know that, hey, you guys are not doing what you need to. But we do have one person who's shouting out your praises, provided Cyril obviously remained. Guys, the reason that government fails comes down to really three things. The first is vote maximizing politicians. These are individuals that obviously go out to the masses with their silver tongues, and they then begin to elicit crowd favor by making sure that they say things that the audience obviously wants to hear, changes that the audience wants to see. And as a result of that, people obviously begin to vote for them. Now, when they're in power, and here it's getting deep, when they're in power, what essentially then happens, guys, is that they will pick projects that will allow them to stay in power, allow them to be re-elected the second time around. And I think sometimes the problem that we face as civilians when it comes to politicians is that one does not build for 100 years. One seems to build for their term in hopes that they get re-elected again. And we'll discuss that in the textbook in its rightful context as well. Then we've got bureaucrats, and bureaucrats are basically still agents in the government. And when I say agents, I'm not talking about how Julius Malema uses the word agent. By the way, I think I hold the man in high regards. Agent in this case refers to the fact that they are deployed by the public to serve the public. Yes, Kieran. Kieran, go
So
right
I
ahead.
just So I just wanted to ask, is a bureaucrat someone that like works at like home affairs or the traffic, what's it called, where you go and get your license? Anyway,
100%.
they, hey,
Yes, yes, those are bureaucrats.
yeah, you see, that's why all these ratings are so low. Like, oh my word, you'll stand in a line at home affairs for 7 hours and just to come to the front and say, oh, sorry, come tomorrow.
I hear you, man. I hear you. I hear you. Oh, you're in the wrong line. I hear you.
Yo,
I totally
yo,
hear
yo, yo, that line. Oh,
you. Now, these things certainly do happen, and yeah, I think sometimes is when it comes to bureaucrats. I mean, they're thinking in their mind, how do I keep my job? And it's not about efficiency. It's more about how do I keep it. And you're 100% right. I think the only time that I really had a favorable thing around just my driver's license, which expired during last year, was at Randburg Police Station, or traffic station, which is the fastest I've ever had to get my license renewed. It's the fastest. I haven't seen that type of efficiency anywhere else in the country apart from SARS and the Gautrain as well. Yeah, things are pretty slow. So that's bureaucrats for you. That's bureaucrats for you. And then lastly, rent-seeking behavior of interest groups. When presidents are going on their campaigns, especially in the United States, where it's really sometimes a tad bit of showmanship that comes into play. You'll find that certain companies or certain individuals will decide to help out when it comes to certain fees around campaigns. I mean, these guys will spend north of 10 million just basically running these specific campaigns. But now, once they're done with the campaigns and they're elected into office, guess who comes back asking for favors? Could only be the people that have obviously helped with their campaign, which is why some parties will actually say we do not want to actually elicit any favors from anyone because they'll obviously depict what we need to do going forward when it comes to policy changes. So, for instance, if let's say SR South African's brewery, South African Reserve Breweries decided, you know what we're going to do? We're going to sponsor Cyril's campaign. And as a result, Cyril then gets into power. When lockdown happens and Cyril decides, hey, we're going to have a alcohol ban, SR, the South African Reserve Bank, sorry, not Reserve Bank, South African breweries can sit down and go, no, Cyril, we're not having any alcohol bans. We're keeping the alcohol. You can do everything else. And that's basically what happens when it comes down to rent-seeking behavior, is when you find companies or individuals find favor with government. And government also typically wants to impress those individuals for various amount of reasons. It could be for resources or it could be for financing. And basically, they make decisions that these people obviously would enjoy, that everybody else, however, suffers because of. I think there was an article that I read yesterday or just saw in passing that talked about how I think it's been 101 billion or 10 billion rand that has been lost um, in the municipalities, that nobody knows where that money is. And such things are obviously not appealing, but that's where sometimes rent-seeking behavior begins to play a specific role. Just let me know, guys, are there any questions in regards to what we've covered thus far? You can put in the chat. The last thing, guys, is just nationalization and privatization, and we'll have a quick discussion about that as we highlight. Nationalization being the transfer of ownership from private enterprise to government, and privatization being the transfer of ownership of assets from the public to the private sector. Right. Let me know if you guys have any questions or any comments that you have in place as we begin to start thinking about how we're going to put all of this into our textbooks, or we're going to record all of this in our textbooks. If you have any questions, let me know. Okay, I'll take that as a no, and I'll begin with the highlighting. On page 310. Page 310. You'll find the role of government in the economy, an overview. And what I want you to do is you'll see the word in bold efficient, the word in bold efficient. And I want you to highlight the following, that whole sentence basically. In other chapters, we pointed out that the free market system is basically an efficient system in the sense that for a given distribution of income, it allocates the available resources in the best possible way. In chapter 11, however, we showed that when markets do not function properly, the market outcome might not be efficient. Moreover, we should always guard against confusing efficiency with equity. Even if market outcomes are efficient, they need not be fair. In a market system, only money votes count, and those without income or wealth cannot register their wants in the marketplace. Yes, money counts for quite a bit. The next thing I want you to highlight would be the paragraph after the one that follows the one that we highlighted, and you'll find the word first in italics. And I want you to highlight the following. It says, first, it should be recognized that private initiative and market forces are generally more efficient than any other possible solution in the basic economic problems of what, how, and for whom. Government should not get involved in the production of goods and services that can be produced more efficiently by the private sector. We'll talk about that very soon. Then the second bit says, second, it is generally accepted, and we're on 311 now, that free markets cannot function properly without government enforcement of the rules under which private households and firms make contracts. And as I illustrated before, when it comes down to countries that are doing very well in their entrepreneurship, it all comes down to how good are things when it comes to regulations and legislation. Next bit that I want you to highlight, still on the same page, 301, sorry, 311. It says, third, cognizance should be taken of the fact that markets do not always produce efficient outcomes. Markets sometimes fail, and when they do, a case for government intervention arises. In other words, government intervention may be required in an attempt to correct market failure. Fourth, market systems produce relatively efficient outcomes, but they do not produce equitable outcomes. It means we use our resources to the best of our ability, but it doesn't mean that things are equitable. Thus, when society has other goals such as an equitable distribution of income and wealth, which the market system cannot provide, a further justification for government intervention arises. So pretty interesting stuff. Pretty interesting stuff. And how government obviously wants to be part and parcel of intervening when there's market failure and the like. Go ahead, Kieran. Go ahead.
So can you just explain what it says by, I mean, what is meant by it's not equitable? So basically, they put so many resources into developing whatever they are developing, but they're not getting what, like, what is it, like, what is expected back? Like, they aren't getting a profit or anything. Is that what it means?
In this case, no. But I know that you know how this sentence obviously concludes itself. The rich get richer and the poor get
Poorer.
100%. So what they're talking about there is that, Kieran, if you're in a place where you have the right networks, you've got a good idea, and you've got the finances to back it, you can create a very good business. And what you obviously do with the profits is that you'll begin to obtain a life that is financially stable, but then you'll take some of that money and obviously invest it back into your business or any other idea that you may have. And that process over 10 periods, well, 10 years, I mean to say, will obviously compound itself. And therefore, Kieran, you obviously become much richer than you would have started out initially. Now, on the other hand, if there's somebody else who does not have the networks, does not have the capital, or the know-how, they basically remain in that same position. In 10 years' time, if they don't improve their standard of living, things only get worse because of inflation. Things are obviously more expensive. So when they say equitable, it means that it's not fair. Not everybody has the chance to obviously make something of themselves. And those that do continue to make a bigger thing for themselves, and those that do not obviously become worse off. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
No, pleasure's mine. Always value your inputs. Anyone else? And if you're good, just give me a thumbs up in the chat. Great stuff. Thank you, thank you, thank you. On 15.3, still on page 311, I want you to highlight the following. It says allocative efficiency in bold. In section 10.8, we introduced the notion of allocated efficiency. Recall that all allocation resources is efficient when it is impossible to allocate the resources to make at least one person better off without making someone else worse off. And that society's welfare is maximized when the marginal cost of each product is equal to its price in the long run. Market failure occurs when the market system is unable to achieve an efficient allocation of resources. Note that market failure does not mean that nothing good has happened, but rather that the best available outcome has not been reached. And we've got some good graphs to obviously show what that exactly means. On page 312, where we are right now, I'd want you to highlight the following. We examine 5 cases of market failure: monopoly and imperfect competition, public goods, externalities, asymmetric information, and property resources. And out of those 5 guys, externalities and asymmetric information or symmetric information both have graphs. The other 3 do not. So I'll start off obviously with that which does not have graphs, and then get into those that do. Monopoly and imperfect competition. And we all know that at the end of the day, what we don't want is a situation where there's one company that basically is the go-to company for everything. We do not want that. Unless if it's government, it's a different story. Because government's ethos is really about how do we serve the people. Um, well, I know by the marks that we obviously gave them, we might say, so how? But that's really what the government is meant to be doing. That's meant to be its ethos. Right. Now, on market and imperfect competition, I want you to just highlight the bullet points. Right. So when it comes down to what government does, a first option is to do nothing and to simply trust that large profits will attract competitors to the market concerned. And you remember in first semester economics that when there's huge profits in the industry, more firms obviously want to join that industry because they want to make money as well. So the government says, well, hopefully these guys will look at that and want to make money themselves. But here's the problem with that thinking. You've got to realize that the entrepreneurs that have been there for years, that have the capital, that might decide to wage a price war, and as a result might shorten your lifespan in regards to your company that you would have wanted. So it's not just about that. And I think that is an important point for government, that do not leave it up to the entrepreneur. Find means and ways to either subsidize them or protect them at least for a couple of years, and then let them go and see whether they can actually fend for themselves. The second bit says that a second possibility is to impose price control in an attempt to prevent unduly high prices. This option is intuitively attractive and has often been applied in practice. Now, we also did price floors and price ceilings last semester. And what you realize is that this is what government sometimes does in order to ensure that companies are not being exploitative. But that being said, this is very hard to administer. So therefore, whilst it is a good idea, government can't go to store by store and say, are you charging X amount for your product? They just, in good faith, hope that everybody will obviously listen. The third possibility is to tax the full excess profits of monopolists. This, however, also is subject to various problems. The monopolist can, for example, shift part of the tax to the consumer in the form of higher prices. And we'll deal with this towards the end. It's called tax incidence. And the last one says there, a fourth option is to regulate monopoly through competition policy. And I think out of the four, that is usually the best route for government to actually take. Still on page 312, we have one sentence above the public goods that I want us to highlight. It says, in the case of natural monopoly, government either regulates private production or undertakes the production itself. At the time of writing, the latter included the provision of railways and harbors by Transnet, the provision of electricity by Eskom, and the provision of water by Ngeni Water in KwaZulu-Natal and Rand Water in Gauteng. Out of those four, let me know in the chat, which one would you, if you were in government, which one would you administer as a way to intervene in the marketplace? Would it be one, two, three, or four? If you're a government, which would you use to intervene the marketplace? Would it be one, two, three, or four? Let me know in the chat and give me a brief reason as to why. Come on, guys. You are the government currently, and you have a decision to make, being which one of these are we going to use to address market failure? Is it going to be one, do nothing, two, impose price controls, price floors or price ceilings? Will it be the third, to tax full excess profits, or would it be the fourth, to just ensure there's a competition policy? Let me know which one you would pick. One, two, three, or four. All right, Kieran, you say four. Great. Everyone else, what's your take? Moisey says, take price ceiling. Caesar says, impose price control. Interesting. Interesting. Okay. On that note, I'll continue. I'm curious as to ask why the price controls, and Kieran, just let us know why four as well. Just want to understand the logic behind as well.
So I was gonna think that I mean, if you put in a competition policy, I would say that like it's kind of like saying it's fair game for everyone. So if you put in the work, you'll get out, but if you don't, then you won't. But I mean, I know there's obviously some cases where like some people are trapped, where like if a business just isn't doing well, then it just isn't doing well. But
Mm.
I just feel like if you make it fair game for everyone, then it's like the strongest. I mean, oh my gosh, did I just lose the saying? I live by this saying. Ah,
As soon as the
strongest.
saying comes, please go ahead.
Exactly. It just poof gone. But anyway, yeah. So basically, if you give every single person a fighting chance, you'll actually be surprised about what can arise from that. Well, that's what I think.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Thank you for that. And yourself, Sizwe and Moeti, let me know. Yes, Moeti. Go ahead, Moeti. Moeti? Okay, I presume that might have been a mistake. Sizwe says maximum can reduce price of goods for consumers to make more affordable or make it more affordable, and minimum prices can increase the amount producers receive. That sounds like a very seasoned economist right there. Um, thank you, gentlemen, or rather, Kieran and Sizwe. Thank you, Moiti. Thank you as well for your takes, guys. Public goods. Before we go on to break, public goods are really divided into about four different types of categories. No problem, no problem. And I want you to highlight the following on public goods. It'll be rivalrous in consumption, that bold bit. A good is rivalrous in consumption if no two persons can consume the same unit of a good. Then we skip a couple of sentences to the other bold words, and it says, on the other hand, a good is non rivalrous in consumption if the consumption by one person does not reduce its consumption by others. The next bit there that I want you to highlight, it's in bold. It says, a good is excludable if it is possible or prohibitively costly to exclude someone from receiving the benefits of the good after it has been produced. In other words, a good is excludable if people can be prevented from obtaining it. And this could just be simply by a price tag. Those who can afford it will purchase it. Those that cannot afford it will not purchase it. And if there's only one of those things, then one of us will have it and the other will not. And then it has at the bottom non-excludable. And I want you to highlight the following. It says most consumer goods and services are excludable. On the other hand, a good or service is non-excludable if once it has been produced, there's no way of stopping anyone from consuming it. When I was younger and I'd want to go to like certain places, I just had my license. I would pay for the fuel in the car, right? My parents would always say, you pay for your own fuel. If you want to go somewhere, you pay for it. And my brother would not necessarily always do that. And as a result, he was, well, what we call free riding, but he was basically inside the car, would go to the places, realize the benefits of obviously being there, but not necessarily having paid it. And in that case, the car was non-excludable because he could enjoy the benefit without necessarily stopping me from enjoying it as well. The only thing that would obviously be at arms about was the fact that it was free for him and price costly for me. Right. Then what I'd want you to also highlight before the break, guys, would just be those four quadrants as well on page 313, those four bullet points. Please make sure you highlight those. The first quadrant contains goods and services that are both rivalrous in consumption and excludable. These goods are called normal goods and pure private goods and represent the type of goods and services that should preferably be produced by the private sector. And it says there the second quadrant contains goods that are rivalrous in consumption but non excludable. They are called common property resources. Still on page 33, on to the right. The third quadrant contains goods that are excludable but non-rivalrous in consumption. And then the last bullet point there. The fourth quadrant contains goods that are rivalrous in consumption and non-excludable. And then just the last sentence in that paragraph reads the following. In other words, not all goods provided by the public sector are public goods. Public goods and private goods are categorized according to their characteristics, not by which sector ends up providing them. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll see you at 2 o'clock on the dot. Okay, guys, we're back in action.
Come on now, bro. Go sit your butt down. You sat down. Yeah, you sat down. Yeah. All right. I don't have.
Sorry about that, podcast. So, in regards to externalities, I want you to highlight the following on externalities. On page 315. Wait, before we do that, we haven't really gone through the rivalries on 313, guys. Please turn to your books to 313. Just in concern with just the goods there, you'll find private goods in section 1, common property in section 2, which we'll discuss later as well, common 3, and then your 3 would be your mixed goods, and your 4th will be your public goods. Tell me, when it comes to pure private goods, which would be better to produce them? Your private firms or your government? Let me know in the chat. When it comes to pure private goods, who would be best to produce them? Government or private firm? Okay, awesome, Ria. Just let's wait for one more. The question was on page 314, 313, I mean to say. There are different types of goods. You got your private goods, your mixed goods, your public goods, and your common property. I was just asking about private goods. Who would be best to produce them, private or government? And Ria has put across that, hey, it has to be private. Awesome. What about the second group, common property? Who would be best to produce those? Would it be government or would it be firms? Common property, government or firms? Government Ria says, private Caesar says. Right. So in this case, guys, it would actually be a mix of the two. And we'll realize in common property that government will typically own most of that, but what they will do is that they will allow the private sector to basically buy licenses and so forth, and then they'll regulate that going forward. What about mixed goods? Mixed goods, would it be the government? Would it be private sector? Would it be a mix of both? Let me know. Thank you, Caesar. Everybody else? Who agrees? Okay. All right. All right. Private. Okay, cool. And that also would be 50-50 in that regard. Then lastly, when it comes down, awesome, Jared. Lastly, when it comes down to your public goods, defense, street lights, public information, broadcast signals, and basic research, let me know what your response to that would be. Private or government? Caesar has an interesting answer there. He says both. Well said, sir. You read my mind there. I was about to ask, explain. All right. Now, usually in this case, as you put across Caesar, you'll find that government contracts, and therefore government would be the main um, producers in that regard. But most of the time, not most of the time, would be the main producers. But there'll be some things, obviously, that they'll need to contract out, and we'll definitely touch on that a couple of sessions from here. Thanks so much, guys, for the input. Highly appreciated. On page 214, you'll see something that says free riding. And I want you guys to highlight the following. On page 314, it says free riding arises when some or all consumers believe that the product will be provided anyway, whether or not they pay for it. For example, everyone wants street lighting, but no one wants to pay for it, knowing that they cannot be excluded from the benefit once the lights have been installed. This is why government usually levies taxes to finance such non-excludable goods. On page 315, I'm going to ask you guys to do the following. Number one, make sure that you have a pen. And number two, make sure that you have a paper. And number three, let me know when you have both of those because we want to go through a graph. And I think the only way that you'll really understand is that if you do it with me. So as soon as you have a paper and pen, paper and pen, yes, please just put a thumbs up in the chat so that we can go through graph figure 15.3 on page 315. Awesome, Zima. Awesome, Liseri. Awesome, Caesar. Awesome, Litle. Good stuff, Melissa. Great, guys. So when it comes down to externalities, I'm going to give you guys two different equations for you to put across. Awesome, Jared. The first one is MSC is greater than MPC. And then the next is MSC is less than MPC. Now, what these two things mean, MSC is marginal social cost, and your MPC is marginal private cost. Whenever your marginal social cost, the cost of something to society, is more than your marginal product cost, then we call this a negative a negative externality. However, if your marginal social cost is less than your marginal production cost, then we call this a positive externality. Now, a negative externality is basically, or an externality as a whole, is basically costs or benefits of a transaction or activity that are borne or enjoyed by parties not directly involved in the transaction or activity. This is the same as, say, someone who plants trees, right, in their garden or in their home. And as a result of the trees being there, if they grow big enough and they're, let's say, next to your wall, you get shade as a result. That's a positive externality. A negative externality, however, would be secondhand smoking. That is going to be a negative externality. Basically, it all comes down to, as an effect of one thing happening, what happens next. Is that positive or negative? If it's negative, it's a negative externality. If it's positive, it's a positive externality. We then have figure 15.3 in front of us. And the question is, how do we show a negative externality? Well, first and foremost, we start off with our y-axis, and then we go to our x-axis. On our x-axis, we've got Q. On our y-axis, we've got P, a 0. And then we have two lines. We have a demand curve, and we have a supply curve. But this supply is equals to your marginal product cost. Where the demand for the product and the marginal product cost meet is the equilibrium. And we'll call that E1. Right. Now, just let me know whether your graph looks like this or not yet. Just give me a thumbs up if your graph looks like this. Awesome, Zima. Great, Palesa. Awesome, Lisa. So we know for a fact that government says that you guys are not doing this efficiently. You guys are costing the community more by having it. Awesome, Precious, awesome, Rutabile. By having products that you're producing, you are producing some pollution. So there's a marginal social cost that is much more than you guys are obviously producing. So what we're going to do is we're going to impose a tax, or we're going to impose a regulation that will basically get you in a space that your marginal production cost begins to equal your marginal social cost. And that means that the factors of production become more expensive to actually use and produce. Now, judging from what we learned from last semester when it comes to determinants of supply, in this case, right? If the production factors increase by price, will there be a rightward shift of the supply curve, or will there be a leftward shift of the supply curve? Let me know in the chat. Rightward or leftward shift? Awesome, Kieran. Rightward or leftward shift? If the costs of production increases when we deal with the supply curve, will there be a leftward shift or a rightward shift? Jared says leftward shift. Everybody else, what's your take? Okay, great. Great stuff, guys. Great stuff. So there'll be a leftward shift. And this is where now your MSC is equals to your MPC. Your marginal social cost is now equal to your marginal production cost. And this causes a leftward shift of the supply curve. And now the price, as a result of this company being more efficient, the price increases and the quantity decreases. Now, remember what we said, that just because a company is not doing things efficiently doesn't mean that they're not doing good. Okay? So here we find a very interesting predicament, because these guys are now producing a whole lot less, right? To make sure that their marginal social cost is equal to their marginal production cost. So we look at Q1 and say, but by how much exactly are these guys losing out on? And what would we call that as well? Well, we just simply go up on Q1 and we look at this shaded area, and this shaded area is now called the welfare loss to society. Because basically, because there's less of this product being made, it means that we lose out on the shaded blue area. Let me know if that makes sense in the chat. Okay, let me know what doesn't make sense. Sure, I'll be more than happy to repeat that. Let me just know what doesn't make sense, Lesedi. The welfare concept. Okay, cool. So when we say welfare, especially when we talk about welfare loss to society, it just means that we as a society do not obtain that benefit anymore. So originally at Q1, our quantity was much larger than Q2. So there's a quantity that we are now not having because of the change of this organization to start making sure that their marginal production cost equals their marginal social cost. And now we're actually curious as to what exactly that welfare loss to society would be. So how we calculate that is that we look at where Q1 is, and we continue to draw a dotted line until we get to our new marginal social cost, which is equals to our marginal production cost line, supply curve. And as a result, we then sit down and go, we could have had this specific quantity, but now we'll never have this quantity because we're now producing, as a firm, we're now producing at Q2. So therefore, all of this has now been lost. And that would be lost, obviously, at the same price of, wait, let me just stop there. Right? Does that make more sense? Let me know. Yes, Lesedi. Lesedi?
So,
Yes.
So can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, so I was asking, so since the firm is producing at like a lesser amount than what they did before, that difference represents the benefit the product could have provided to society. Is that why they call it the welfare cost to society?
Yes, yes. Back to the answer there. Thanks for asking. So because this firm at the original equilibrium was not operating efficiently, right? It then begins to operate efficiently, but because it operates efficiently, it then moves to E2. So if they had been operating efficiently at E1 from the get-go, right, society would have had what's inside this triangle. But because they weren't, and now they are now operating efficiently at a higher price, society loses out on this because they were not efficient. I hope that makes more sense, Felicity. Let me know. Okay, I'll take that as a yes. Litle, are we on the same bus? Everybody else, let me know what your thoughts are. Awesome. Great. Sizwe, great. Great, Christopher. Okay. All right. What's really important about this, guys, at the end of the day, is that government does not want a situation where the marginal social cost is greater than the marginal production cost. They will want a situation where the marginal social cost is less than the marginal product cost. And that's when positive externalities come into play. And when we have a positive externality, essentially that means that people are benefiting a whole lot more from something being produced. Now, unfortunately, your your firms will obviously produce a whole lot more goods that are inefficient in the sense that they have a negative externality. They produce more of that, as you've seen in this specific graph. But outside of the positive externalities, our government actually needs to subsidize firms and so forth in order to consistently produce whatever it is that they have to get that positive externality. Things like research, for instance, being one of them. I'm going to ask you to highlight the following on page 315. Well, let's go to 314 first, sorry, and highlight the following. It says externalities are the costs of or benefits of transaction or activity that are borne or enjoyed by parties not directly involved in the transaction or activity. They are also called third-party effects, spillover effects, or neighborhood effects. Where they are external costs, we refer to negative externalities. Where they are external benefits, the term positive externalities is used. And then still on page 314, right-hand side, last
So
sentence in that paragraph. Yep.
I just wanted to ask the last thing you highlighted. I actually, the whole time you're reading, I was just find where was it on page 314 or 315.
Very good question, sir. We're on page 314, underneath externalities. We highlighted everything, including the positive analysis. As soon as you get to positive externalities is used, basically. So the first sentence all the way until the bold positive externalities.
Thank you so much.
Always a pleasure. All right, still on page 314. So on page 314, last sentence says the basic points are the following. External costs resulting in socially inefficient allocation of resources. Governments should try to improve the situation, and all potential solutions are subject to serious practical problems. So with the first one, external costs result in social inefficient allocation of resources. It really just talks about how companies that are not necessarily, or rather companies that are currently in a space where they are giving negative externalities, they're not necessarily using their resources to the best of their ability. And then the next bullet point obviously just highlights that government needs to step in and do something about it. And the last point says, hey, you know what? It's actually very hard to also monitor. Um, and that's us on now page 315. Then under external benefits, I'd want you to highlight the last paragraph in external benefits of production. It says, if external benefits are experienced, the marginal social cost, MSC, will be lower than the marginal private cost, MPC, again, resulting in the socially inefficient allocation of resources. In this case, however, the problem is that too little is produced. Governments therefore have often intervene, therefore often intervene by subsidizing activities that are subject to external benefits. The aim is once again to internalize the externality, but the problem and the solutions are obverse of those pertaining to external costs. Let's shift to asymmetric information. There's nothing else on externalities. Please feel free to put up your hand if there is. Asymmetric information. The third sentence from the top, it says, to make informed decisions, households and firms must have full information on the quality, availability, and price of goods and services and inputs. In the world, however, there is often a great deal of ignorance and uncertainty, which make it virtually impossible for consumers and firms to equate marginal benefit with marginal cost. Just out of curiosity, and we'll just take a quick breather as well. In the chat, let me know how many of you have made a decision, and after making that decision, a few months later or a couple of years later, you go, "Oh snap! If I had more information, I'd have made a different decision." Let me know in the chat. You don't need to tell us what that decision was, but just in general, has that been you? If so, please let us know in the chat. Awesome, Zima. I join you with that. Okay, Ria. We're forming a coalition here now. Caesar says many times. Christopher also says yes, and Kieran says yep. Right? It's the same thing in economics, guys. At the end of the day, we make mistakes. Shahid says more than once. We make mistakes. It's part and parcel of life. The good thing is that provided you learn from your mistakes, you can always improve. But if you don't learn from your mistakes, you are bound to repeat them. And as a result of repeating them, you obviously are nowhere better. Now, society as well, guys, have made these mistakes. Once upon a time, you will not believe it, cigarette smoking was actually something that was seen as a healthy habit that people actually promoted and said, sir, you should actually smoke a lot more. It's healthy for you. Once upon a time. Did you guys know that?
As was cocaine and morphine. Well, actually, morphine's still used, technically.
I see. Yes. Some good information there.
I mean,
yes, Kieran.
Freud.
Go ahead, Christopher, seeing that you're already speaking.
Freud actually prescribed cocaine for a lot of mental health issues.
Interesting. Okay, duly noted, man. Duly noted. Thanks for sharing that, Christopher. I'll use that as well.
So
yeah, go ahead, Kieran.
I just wanted to ask, did you just say that smoking sometimes is good for you?
Say that again. That smoking?
No, so I just want to ask if you said that smoking is sometimes good for you, because I'm just asking because
Okay.
I never knew that. Or
No, it's that when when the tobacco industry sort of started like in the like 18 or late 19th century into the up until the 80s or something or somewhat recently, smoking was seen as
it wasn't
not
bad.
harmful at all, and people thought it wasn't harmful, and doctors would actually prescribe cigarettes to help people relax, which I guess it works, but and also to clean up the lungs.
There we go. There's the reason behind it.
Clean up the lungs.
Yes, 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 yes.
Yes.
Clean up the lungs. Clean up the
Oh,
lungs.
eh?
And
So
Zima,
yeah,
you're
they got it
saying
entirely.
entirely wrong. Entirely wrong. Zima, you're saying, how is that healthy, sir, if humans aren't built with chimneys to release the smoke? A, talk to a doctor then, that are probably giving you the ones and twos. But they did actually say that. So now that we know better, right? And this is obviously no judgment on anybody that does smoke here. That's not the point. We're just dealing with asymmetric information here. If we all knew this based on the new information that we have now, and we used to smoke, what would happen to the demand of cigarettes after this newfound knowledge? Would it increase or would it decrease? Zima says decrease. Not about that chimney life, I presume. And Litle also says no, it would decrease. Absolutely, guys. Absolutely. 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 So it would decrease. And if we look at figure 15.4 on page 316, we see how this can obviously be represented by a graph. So wherever you are, please make sure you're drawing this with me. We have our supply curve here. We have our demand curve here. And this is asymmetric information in the goods market. So just make sure you also have the title written there. Don't write everything. Asymmetric information, right, in a goods market. So before, our equilibrium point was at E0. And this is also where there was a equilibrium quantity at an equilibrium price. And DD was the original curve. But now with the new information that we have around this specific product, we then obviously, like you guys have put across, we begin to demand less. And as shown by a graph, we realize that when demand decreases, we shift to the left. So we shift to the left. We show that shift via an arrow. We now have a new equilibrium, E1, which has less of a quantity as a result of this new information. And the prices drop as a result of this new information as well. And totally unrelated, guys, but something that I've seen as well. Once this virus was called Corona, the price of Corona, the alcoholic beverage, dropped severely. because people were not buying it because for some strange reason they equated that Corona and COVID are more or less the same, right? Funny enough, that's the interesting thing about a name. But as a result, what Corona did was that they obviously began to decrease their pricing. Yes, sir.
Funny thing, on like the first last year, the first sort of day I went onto campus and was waiting for lectures. One of the first things I saw was a guy in a Corona beer hoodie. I thought very poor timing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. Oh, Jared, it didn't drop, so it was just a worldwide thing. Clearly, we don't care. We don't care. Um, Kieran, Kieran feels off. Kieran feels the opposite, right? But guys, this is asymmetric information. Is there anything around this that does not make sense? Please let me know in the chat. If it does make sense, just give me a thumbs up. Awesome. Good. That's a brilliant, brilliant question. In this case, it will be the latter. We just assess the correlation between a piece of information and the product, because it will be very hard for us to actually measure the amount of information that consumers actually have. You can't, one, it's very hard to measure something of that nature, unless if you're going with a qualitative study, where it's just a matter of yes or no, as opposed to having a quantitative study done in that regard. That's a brilliant question, Leslie. Thank you. Okay, let's get down to highlighting. Page 316. The last sentence in the first paragraph, it says the following. The new equilibrium is the socially efficient one, sorry. With asymmetric information, there is an inefficient allocation of resources, which means that there's a higher demand until we find out that, hey, we're not supposed to be doing this, and things obviously change as a result. Still on page 316, top right, you'll find the words in bold, principal agent problem. And I want you to highlight the following. Asymmetric information. Asymmetric information is also the cause of principal agent problem, which we introduced in box 9.1. Management often has more information about the firm than the owners, shareholders. Doctors have more information about their patients. Lawyers have more information about their clients, and so on. In each case, the party with the superior knowledge can use it to his or her advantage. Doctors, for example, can use the demand of their services by which they do not by which they do or do not tell their patients. And the situation is exacerbated if the payment occurs through a third party, such as medical aid or insurance. There was a time when doctors were being criticized to say the amounts that you're charging medical aid are exorbitant simply because you know that medical aid will pay a whole lot more as opposed to if the patient had cash. And that's the question whenever you enter. Do you have medical aid? Right above common property resources, the last sentence there is also pretty important. Government can impose standards which consumer products have to meet, or safety standards in the workplace which employers have to adhere to. But it will never be to eliminate the problem, never be able to eliminate the problem, which is the truth. We are consistently finding out new things consistently. And as a result, we will never be in a position where we actually eliminate everything. Right. Still on 315, it says common property resources. First sentence. Common property resources are those that are non-excludable by rivalrous in consumption, which means that all of us have access to it, but few of us who consume it will obviously not have something for the other person. So it basically means that it's not shareable. All of us can have a piece of it, but it's not shareable. Right. In the second paragraph, last two sentences, it says instead, common resources tend to be overexploited, even to the extent of destruction. This is often referred to as the tragedy of the commons. This is a factor that has to be considered when with regard to land reform in South Africa. On page 318, first paragraph at the top, last sentence, it says, in the absence of regulation, there will thus be a tendency to overexploit the resource. And then still on 318, um, second paragraph from the top, it starts with the word clearly. It says, clearly, government has a role to play in protecting or avoiding the overexploitation of common properties resources. One possibility is to regulate the use of the resource. And then skip a couple of sentences, you'll see a major problem. It says, a major problem, however, is the enforcement of the restrictions. A common resource like the ocean is vast. And although all the appropriate laws, rules, and regulations may be in place, it may prove almost impossible to enforce them. Right column, still page 318. Third sentence, it says, when a common property resource is privatized in such a way, it is usually used more efficiently, but those who are excluded in the process lose out. So this would be Jared owning or having the funds to own a park. He purchases the park from the government, and as a result, whilst it was non-excludable to begin with, it now becomes excludable because the person that owns it is only Jared. 15.4, further reasons for government intervention in the economy. Income distribution. First sentence there says, the first market tends to generate an unequal distribution of income. The free market tends to generate an unequal distribution of income. On page 319, last sentence, there says the distribution of income determines the structure of demand, and economists cannot simply pretend that it is not an economic issue. Right? This is huge, guys. Disparity is a very huge thing, especially when it comes down to your income. And the more that gap increases, the more likely the chances of a civil war. In the third paragraph, it says, in a well-functioning economic, third paragraph, let me just count the sentences. The third sentence from the top, it says, in a well-functioning economic system, there should always be some link between reward and effort. Nevertheless, a free market system rewards certain participants and penalizes others. Because the workings of the market may be stern, even cruel, society even chooses to intervene to attempt to produce a more sociable, acceptable income distributions. Right? The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. That's the sentence that I would use to convey that idea. In the next paragraph, it would be the third sentence from the in that paragraph. It says the measures that government usually take in this regard include progressive income taxation, which means the greater your income, the greater the percentage of the tax you pay. Then two, free or subsidized provision of certain goods and services to those who can afford, to those who can least afford it, cash payments to the needy, and legislation and other forms of regulation. Last thing to highlight there, in that paragraph right at the bottom on 319, to the left, the second sentence, it says, Government has to avoid a situation where certain individuals or groups simply claim a certain income or standard of living irrespective of their input or effort. Such entitlement can have disastrous economic implications. And then on 319, you'll find macroeconomic growth and stability. You'll see the macroeconomic policy consists of monetary, fiscal, and other policies. You see monetary policy in bold, right? Macroeconomic policy, sorry, consists of monetary, fiscal, and other policies. Monetary policy was introduced in Chapter 14. The major instrument of fiscal policy in South Africa is the budget presented annually by the Minister of Finance. The meaning of fiscal policy and various elements of fiscal policy are explained later in this chapter. And we then shift on to merit goods. I think we'll stop at the summary. So merit goods, I want you, when you see the words merit goods in bold, please highlight that. It says merit goods can be defined as goods that are regarded as so beneficial to society that everyone should be in possession irrespective of their incomes to receive or consume them. And then skip all the way to the merit bads and demerit goods, and it says, just as they are socially beneficial merit goods, there are also merit bads and demerit goods that are regarded as socially harmful. Skip two sentences. Since merit goods and bads involve value judgments, the provision of such goods can be quite controversial, e.g., smoking. Some of us may say smoking is terrible, others will say, what's it your decision? It doesn't affect you. And therefore, we should let people obviously make a decision for their own lives, right? And these are two different sets of people with two different viewpoints. And if they're put in power, the person who obviously feels that smoking is bad will obviously not condone it and it may come to a halt. On the other hand, the other person that feels that no, we can't do it will say nope, or I'm not going to obviously do that. So it's a very value judgment orientated thing. What government does do, however, because it does bear the brunt of those who will get ill or those that do get ill, I'm not saying will, I'm not too sure about that, is that they'll charge a thing called sin taxes. And we'll hear about sin taxes in the sense of things that are charged on alcohol, taxes that are charged on alcohol and your cigarettes, basically habit forming drugs in this case. That is what sin tax is charged. And not sin in the sense of SIN, religious wise, it's SYN that we'll be looking at. And then the last thing for you guys to highlight will be the following, the summary there, which is very important. The allocated function, it says that we have now examined various reasons why government intervenes in the economy. The role of government in the economy can be summarized by distinguishing between three broad functions of government. The allocative function, which refers to the role of government in correcting market failure and achieving a more efficient allocation of resources. I like that. And then the second one is the distributive function, which refers to steps taken by the government to achieve more equitable or socially acceptable distribution of income than generated by market forces. And then the last one, the stabilization function, which refers to the measures taken by government to promote macroeconomic stability. Guys, for today, we'll end here. What I would ask you to do is make sure you read the rest of the chapter. We will go through it together, as always, but it'll be in your best benefit to obviously make sure that you go through it by yourselves as well. Are there any questions in regards to what we've studied thus far? Let me know in the chat. All right, it's good. Actions are punishable in certain ways, in this case, punishing. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. No questions, no questions, no questions. Okay. That being said, guys, do enjoy the weekend. I know that Friday sessions are obviously tough on the mind in the sense of it's people just want to go and enjoy the weekend. But well done on your discipline and determination as well. All the best for the weekend. I'll see you guys next week. Thank you, sir. Yes, come on.
Sorry, sir, that was a mistake.